My wife cheated with the plumber who was supposed to fix the sink. I almost lost control. For more than 10 years, my life moved in a straight line, and I trusted that line. I met my wife when I was still renting a tiny room and dreaming about owning my own store. She believed in me before there was anything to believe in. At least that is what I told myself for years. We grew together slowly, not loudly. No scandals, no dramatic fights, just work, plans, routines. I built my clothing store piece by piece, learned fabrics, suppliers, seasons, mistakes that cost money, and lessons that paid later. The store was never huge, but it was stable, and stability became the word I used to describe my life. We moved into a nice apartment after the 3rd year of marriage. Nothing luxury, but clean and warm and ours. Every corner filled with things we chose together. Mornings were predictable, evenings were calm, weekends were usually quiet, and I thought that was success. My wife often said she liked how calm our life was. She liked knowing what tomorrow would look like. She said chaos was for people who did not know what they wanted. I agreed with her, because I wanted control, not over people, but over my future. I worked long hours, sometimes too long, but I always came home, always checked in, always believed that effort would protect what I loved. When customers praised the store or sales were good, I felt proud, not because of money, but because it proved that patience worked. My wife supported me in her own way. She handled the apartment, small details, daily things I did not think about, and I trusted her completely. I never checked her phone, never questioned where she was, never thought I needed to. Trust felt like something you either had or you did not, and I believed we had it. The first strange thing happened weeks before the sink problem, but at the time I did not label it as strange, just different. My wife started mentioning small repairs more often, the door making noise, the cabinet hinge loose, the light flickering, things that never bothered her before. I promised to fix them when I had time. She nodded, but her patience seemed thinner than usual. I blamed stress, blamed routine, blamed myself for working too much. I told myself marriages go through quiet phases. Not every distance means danger. Sometimes it just means tired people sharing space, and I believed that explanation because it was comfortable. At the store, things were going well, better than usual actually. A new supplier worked out, winter sales were strong, and I started thinking about expanding next year. Maybe a second location, maybe online orders. Plans filled my head and pushed everything else into the background. When I came home late, my wife was often already on the couch with the television on, not really watching, just letting sound fill the room. We talked less, but not in a dramatic way, more like two people who assumed there will be time later. That assumption felt harmless, almost responsible. I never imagined it could be dangerous. The sink started leaking on a Tuesday evening, slow at first, a sound you only hear when the apartment is quiet, drip after drip. I looked under the cabinet, saw moisture, wiped it away, tightened what I could, told my wife it was nothing serious. She watched closely, more closely than I expected, and asked if we should call someone. I said not yet, tomorrow maybe. She did not argue, but I noticed she stayed in the kitchen longer than usual after that, listening, like the sound bothered her more than it should. That night, I barely slept, not because of the leak, but because my mind was full of plans and numbers and store layouts. I woke up early and left before she did, kissing her on the forehead like always. The next day at work was busy. Deliveries came late. A customer complained loudly. My phone kept vibrating with messages, and sometime around noon my wife texted me again about the sink. She said it was worse, that water was spreading, that we needed a plumber. I agreed, told her to call the building manager. I did not think twice about it. It felt like a normal problem in a normal life. When she texted that the plumber could come in the afternoon, I told her I would be out running errands anyway. It made sense for her to stay home. Everything about that decision felt logical, routine, safe. As I left the store that afternoon, I remember feeling oddly satisfied, like things were moving forward. I thought about dinner, about the weekend, about maybe taking a short trip after the busy season. My phone stayed silent during the drive, no updates, no questions. I assumed the plumber was working. I did not rush. There was no reason to. When I reached our building, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the entrance. And for a brief moment, I felt a strange hesitation before going inside. Not fear, not suspicion, just a pause. The kind you feel before opening a door without knowing why. I shook it off immediately, told myself I was tired, told myself nothing was wrong, and stepped forward, completely unaware that this ordinary day was quietly positioning itself to divide my life into before and after. When I opened the apartment door that evening, everything looked the same as always. The lights were on. The television murmured in the background. My wife greeted me from the kitchen with a calm voice. Too calm maybe, but I ignored the thought as soon as it appeared. I put my keys down, took off my jacket, and asked how the plumber visit went. She said it was fine, that the leak was more serious than expected but manageable. Her answers were short, efficient, like she was reading from a list. I noticed the cabinet doors were still open and towels were spread on the floor. The smell of damp wood lingered in the air. I asked if the plumber would need to come back. She said maybe, not sure yet. I nodded and moved on. Routine had trained me not to push small things. We ate dinner together, but the conversation felt thinner than usual, not tense, just light in the wrong way. Like something important was being avoided by mutual agreement. I talked about the store, about numbers and suppliers. She listened and nodded, asked polite questions, but her attention drifted often toward her phone. She checked it face down on the table, then slid it into her pocket when she noticed me looking. I told myself not to be ridiculous. People check their phones. That means nothing. I had never been the kind of man who searched for hidden meanings in normal behavior. Trust had always felt simpler than suspicion. Later that night, I stood in the kitchen fixing the cabinet hinge she had mentioned earlier, tightening screws, focusing on something physical, something I could control. My wife watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She asked if I needed help. I said no, and she stayed there anyway, silent. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be observed like that in my own home. But again, I brushed it aside. People change, days are different. Marriages breathe in and out. That is what I believed. Over the next few days, small details began to collect quietly. Not enough to alarm me, but enough to register somewhere deep. My wife started asking about my schedule more precisely. Not just when I would be home, but when I would leave, how long errands would take, whether I would be at the store all day or moving around. I answered without hesitation. I had nothing to hide, and because I trusted her, I assumed the questions were harmless. Maybe she was planning something. Maybe she just wanted to align our time better. I even felt a small warmth thinking she might want us to reconnect. The plumber came back once more later that week. I was not home that time either. A delivery had arrived early, and I stayed longer at the store. My wife texted that everything was finally fixed. No more leaks. Problem solved. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and kept working. I remember standing among boxes of jackets feeling oddly detached, like something important had been resolved without me being present. But I told myself that was the point of hiring professionals. Life moves even when you are not watching. At night I started waking up earlier than usual, not from nightmares, just alert, listening to the apartment sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, the quiet breathing beside me. Sometimes my wife was already awake scrolling on her phone, the screen light reflecting off her face. She would lock it when she noticed me move and say she could not sleep. I would say me neither and turn away. Those moments passed without words, but they stayed with me during the day like unfinished thoughts. My friend, the lawyer, called me one afternoon to grab coffee. Nothing urgent, just casual. He asked how married life was treating me, and I gave the usual answer, busy but good. He smiled in that knowing way people do when they think they understand stability. He talked about cases, about how people often ignore warning signs because routine feels safer than truth. I laughed and said he was becoming cynical. He shrugged and said experience does that. At the time, his words felt general, almost philosophical. I did not connect them to myself. I had no reason to. The weekend came and went quietly. My wife suggested we invite friends over next week, said it would be nice to feel social again. I agreed, thinking it was a good sign. Maybe the distance I felt was already closing. Maybe I was imagining things. On Sunday evening, as I cleaned the kitchen, I noticed a business card on the counter, slightly wet at the corner. I picked it up without thinking. It was from the plumbing company. Nothing unusual, but my wife reacted faster than expected. She reached out and took it from my hand, saying she needed it for records. Her voice was sharp for just a second before smoothing out. She smiled immediately after, too immediately, and for the first time in years I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, but awareness. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I replayed the week in my head. The questions, the timing, the small reactions, none of it proved anything. None of it justified confrontation. But together it formed a shape I did not like. I told myself I was overthinking. That success sometimes makes people paranoid about losing what they built. Yet another part of me whispered that comfort can be dangerous when it teaches you to stop paying attention. And somewhere between those two thoughts I realized something simple and unsettling. Whether I wanted it or not, I had started to watch my own life instead of living it. After that night, something inside me shifted quietly. Not enough to change my behavior on the surface, but enough to sharpen my attention. I did not accuse. I did not ask direct questions. I simply observed. Mornings continued as usual, coffee, brief conversations, routine gestures, but I started noticing timing, tones, pauses between words. My wife moved through the apartment differently, lighter in some moments, tense in others. Like she was balancing something fragile inside herself. She smiled often. Maybe more than before, but the smiles felt placed carefully, like punctuation rather than emotion. At the store, my focus slipped more often. I would stand between racks of clothes holding the same shirt for too long, replaying small scenes from home. The way she checked the lock twice before leaving. The way she angled her phone screen away when messages came in. None of it was dramatic. None of it would convince anyone else. But it began to convince me that something had changed, not suddenly, but gradually, like a slow rearranging of priorities I was not part of. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected, not to test anything. Just because a delivery was canceled, I texted my wife that I was on my way. She replied quickly with a simple okay. When I entered the apartment, she was sitting on the couch fully dressed, shoes on, keys in her hand. She looked surprised for half a second before recovering. Said she was just about to step out to the store. I offered to go instead. She refused gently but firmly. Said she needed the walk. I watched her leave and listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway. And for the first time, the apartment felt unfamiliar, even though nothing was out of place. That evening, she was unusually talkative, telling stories from the day, small interactions, nothing important, filling the space with words. I listened and nodded, noticing how she avoided certain topics without being obvious about it. When I mentioned work, she changed the subject smoothly. When I mentioned plans, she delayed answers. Everything felt managed, controlled, as if she was maintaining balance on a narrow line. I wondered when our conversations had become something to navigate instead of something to share. I started staying later at the store, not because I needed to, but because distance felt easier than pretending nothing was wrong. My wife commented on it once, asked if something had changed. I told her business was growing, which was true, just not the whole truth. She accepted the answer too quickly, relief passing over her face before she turned away, and that relief stayed with me longer than it should have. One night, I woke up to the sound of the shower running, the bathroom light glowing under the door. The clock showed it was past midnight. When she returned to bed, her hair was still damp. She said she could not sleep, that her thoughts were racing. I said nothing, just listened to her breathing slow, and wondered whose thoughts she was trying to quiet, mine or her own. A few days later, my friend the lawyer stopped by the store unexpectedly. He said he was nearby and wanted to say hello. We talked casually, but he studied my face longer than usual. Finally, he asked if everything was really fine. I almost laughed, almost told him everything, but instead I said yes, just tired. He nodded slowly and said tired people miss things, then added, sometimes that is a choice, sometimes it is a mistake. His words stayed with me long after he left. That evening, as I sorted papers at home, I noticed a folded receipt in the trash, not torn, just placed there carelessly. It was from a cafe across town, dated during hours I thought she was home. I picked it up and stared at it, feeling foolish. Receipts prove nothing, schedules change, assumptions fail. I threw it away again and washed my hands as if I could rinse off the thought itself. I began to understand something uncomfortable. Suspicion does not arrive loudly. It seeps in quietly and makes everything heavier. Trust does not break all at once. It thins, stretches, until it no longer feels solid under your weight. I still loved my wife. I still shared a bed with her, still spoke about the future in careful terms. But somewhere inside me, a door had closed softly, and I knew I would not open it again until I understood what was really happening behind it. By the time the next week began, I had learned how to live with uncertainty without showing it. On the outside, nothing changed. I woke up at the same hour, went to the store, answered customers with the same calm tone, came home, and shared meals. But inside, I was measuring everything: time, distance, reactions, not to catch her in something, but to understand when my life had started moving without me noticing. I realized how easy it is to ignore slow changes when you are busy building something else. One evening, I told my wife I would be closing the store early the next day, just casually, part of a longer sentence about inventory. She nodded and said that was good. Then a few minutes later, she asked again what time I would be home, her voice light, almost careless. I answered the same time. She smiled and said okay. Nothing more, but the question echoed in my head long after the conversation ended, not because it was suspicious on its own, but because it felt necessary to her in a way it had never been before. The next day, I did not close early. A supplier arrived late and kept me longer. I texted her to say I would be delayed. She replied with a single word, fine. When I finally got home, the apartment felt unusually quiet, not empty, just paused. She was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed fully dressed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled, said she thought I would be home sooner. I said plans change. She nodded, too quickly, like she was accepting something she had already prepared for. Over the following days, I noticed how often she mentioned practical things, errands, repairs, appointments, reasons to be home during hours she used to spend out. It was subtle, framed as responsibility, as efficiency, things I valued myself, which made it harder to question. Part of me admired her for being organized. Another part wondered why organization suddenly mattered so much. At the store, my assistant commented that I seemed distracted. I laughed it off and blamed paperwork. But the truth was my mind kept drifting back to small images. The way my wife stood by the window when she thought I was asleep. The way she kept the bathroom door locked now. The way her phone never left her hand. None of it was dramatic. None of it deserved confrontation. And that made it worse, because I could not act without proof, and I could not unsee what I was seeing. One afternoon, my friend the lawyer called again, asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat in a quiet place where conversations blend into background noise. He asked me directly this time if something was wrong at home. I told him I did not know, and he nodded like that was the most honest answer possible. He said when people stop knowing, it usually means they stopped asking questions a long time ago. I asked him what he meant. He said nothing more, just told me to be careful with my reactions, not my feelings. Reactions are what people pay for later. Feelings pass on their own. That night at home, I decided to test nothing, to accuse nothing, but to listen. My wife talked about her day, about small frustrations, about things that did not matter, and suddenly she mentioned the sink again. Joked that plumbing problems always bring strangers into your private space. She laughed lightly, then stopped laughing when she noticed my expression, asked if something was wrong. I said no, just tired, but inside my chest tightened, not because of the joke, but because she had brought it up without reason, like a word that escaped before it could be stopped. Later, as we prepared for bed, she received a message. Her phone lit up. She turned the screen away instinctively, then caught herself and forced a smile. Said it was nothing, just spam. I nodded, said goodnight, turned off the light, and stared into the darkness, feeling something settle into place. Not anger, not jealousy, but clarity. I realized I was no longer waiting for reassurance. I was waiting for confirmation, and that was a dangerous line to cross, because once you cross it, you do not go back to comfort. You only move forward to truth, whatever it costs. As I lay there listening to the steady sounds of the apartment, I understood something else. Whatever was happening was not sudden. It was planned around my absence, around my routines, around the trust one had built over years. And that meant if I wanted to protect myself, I could not rush. I could not explode. I would have to do what I had always done best: observe, prepare, and act only when the moment was right. By then, my days were divided into two layers: the visible one where everything looked normal, and the silent one where I kept records in my head. I wrote nothing down, left no trace. I only noticed patterns. My wife left the apartment more often but returned earlier. Her explanations were detailed when they did not need to be, vague when they should have been simple. I answered with the same calm I used with difficult customers, neutral tone, no pressure, because pressure makes people careful, and I needed her careless. At the store, I pretended to focus on growth plans, met with suppliers, talked about expansion, even joked with friends about being busy. Inside, I was counting time windows, the hours when my absence was predictable, the moments when my schedule created space for something else. I realized how much of our life depended on my reliability. I left when I said I would leave, returned when I said I would return. Routine had made me invisible in a way, dependable enough not to be questioned. That thought hurt more than suspicion itself. One evening, my wife asked if I could run errands the next afternoon, pick up something for the store, check a delivery across town. She framed it as helping me, saving time later. I agreed easily and watched relief pass across her face. It lasted only a second, but it was real. That second told me more than any argument ever could. I nodded and said it was a good idea, then added that I might be back earlier than expected depending on traffic. Her expression shifted just slightly, then settled again, and I knew that whatever she had planned depended on precision. The next day, I left the apartment at the usual time, kissed her goodbye, took my jacket, and drove toward the store. I stayed there longer than necessary, organizing shelves that did not need organizing, talking to my assistant about things I already knew, watching the clock without staring at it. At the time, I had told my wife I would be far across town, unreachable for hours. I made sure my phone stayed silent. No calls, no messages, routine behavior, nothing to raise suspicion. As the afternoon stretched on, a strange calm settled over me. Not confidence, not certainty, just acceptance. Whatever I was about to learn would not surprise me anymore. It would only confirm what had already taken shape inside. I left the store later than planned, drove slowly, stopped once for coffee I did not drink, and finally headed home earlier than my wife expected. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a small shift in timing, the kind that slips past notice until it is too late. When I reached the building, the elevator felt louder than usual. Each floor announced itself. My reflection in the mirror looked older. Not from age, but from focus. I rehearsed nothing. Told myself I was only going home. Nothing more. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet for that hour. I reached our door and noticed the lock was not fully turned, just slightly off. The way it had been once before when the plumber visited. My hand rested on the handle longer than necessary. My pulse steady. My thoughts strangely clear. Inside the apartment, the air felt warm, heavier than normal. The television was off. Lights were on in the bedroom, and voices came from behind the closed door, low, close, not loud enough to understand words, but clear enough to understand intent. I did not rush. I did not freeze. I stood there listening, feeling the last pieces settle into place. This was not confusion anymore, not imagination, not paranoia. It was a moment that had been prepared carefully, and now it was happening without me being part of the plan. I stepped back quietly, closed the door behind me without sound, and leaned against the hallway wall, not because I was weak, but because I needed to decide who I would be next, the man who reacts and loses control, or the man who leaves and keeps everything else intact. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from my wife asking where I was. I did not answer. Not yet. I walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Each step measured, each breath controlled, because I understood something crucial in that moment. Knowing the truth is painful, but choosing how to respond is power. I did not go back upstairs. I walked out of the building and let the cold air reset my thoughts. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I sat in the car and turned off my phone without reading the messages that kept coming. I already knew what they would say: confusion, excuses, urgency. None of it mattered yet. I drove to the only place where emotions were not in charge, my friend's office. He was still there even though it was late. He looked at me and understood immediately that the moment had arrived. I told him everything calmly: the patterns, the timing, the unlocked door, the voices behind it. I did not describe details. I did not need to. He did not ask for them. He listened and nodded, then said we would do nothing tonight. No confrontation, no messages, no explanations. He said silence would protect me better than anger ever could. He asked practical questions: whose name was on the lease, how the business was registered, where the savings were held. I answered and realized how many smart decisions I had made without knowing they would matter one day. He told me to sleep somewhere else, to keep my routine visible but distant, to let her assume confusion instead of certainty. He said people reveal more when they think they still have control. I left his office with a clear plan for the first time in weeks. Not revenge, not punishment, just protection. I went to a small hotel near the store and lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely empty, but also focused. My marriage was over, but my life was not, and I understood something important before sleep finally came. Walking away had not made me weak. It had given me time. The following weeks passed without drama on the surface, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I returned to the apartment only when necessary, always briefly, always calm. My wife tried to talk, to explain, to frame everything as confusion, as mistakes, as misunderstandings. I listened without reacting, without agreeing, without arguing, because I already knew the truth, and I did not need her version of it anymore. Silence did more than anger ever could. With my friend's guidance, everything moved quietly into order. The business was clearly separate. The accounts were documented. The apartment arrangements were straightforward. There were no emotional battles in court, only facts, timelines, and decisions made long before emotions took over. My wife expected confrontation, tears, bargaining, but instead she met distance and structure, and that surprised her more than any accusation could have. When everything was finalized, she received nothing from the business I built, nothing from the future I planned, only what was fair and legally hers, no more and no less. I did not celebrate. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear, like someone who finally steps out of fog into open air. I moved into a smaller place near the store, focused on work, expanded the business the following season, and rebuilt my routine slowly. Sometimes people ask why I never confronted her that day, why I chose to walk away instead of demand answers. I tell them the truth. Answers do not change facts, but choices change outcomes. I did not need closure from her. I needed control over my own life, and I kept it. That was the real ending. Not loud, not dramatic,